I used to think that knowing myself would make things easier, that awareness would smooth the edges and quiet the tension I carried everywhere. But instead, it made me more honest about what I had been ignoring. For a long time, I stayed functional rather than present, doing what was expected, saying what sounded right, moving forward without checking whether I was still connected to what I felt. There's a strange realization that comes when you notice how skilled you've become at managing life instead of living it, how often you choose efficiency over sincerity without calling it a choice. Lately, I've been paying attention to the moments when my body hesitates while my mind insists, when something inside me asks for space and I've been trained to override it. Slowing down feels uncomfortable at first, like stepping out of rhythm with the world, and that discomfort reveals how much of my identity was built around momentum. I'm learning that stillness doesn't erase responsibility, it clarifies it. And not listening doesn't weaken direction, it refines it. Old instincts still surface, the urge to explain myself, to stay useful, to remain ahead of uncertainty, and I let them pass without judgment. In that space, awareness feels less like self-improvement and more like self-recognition, a quiet acknowledgement of what has always been there, beneath the effort to become something else. There's a subtle moment when you realize you've been negotiating with yourself for years, promising rest later, honesty later, presence later, as if life were something you could reschedule. I lived that way for a long time, postponing attention to what I felt until it became impossible to ignore, mistaking endurance for resilience and silence for stability. Lately, I've noticed how that internal bargaining shaped my reactions, how quickly I minimized discomfort, how automatically I pushed through signals that asked me to slow down. There's a quiet courage in admitting that survival strategies don't always age well, that what once protected you can quietly limit you if left unquestioned. I'm beginning to understand that alignment doesn't arrive as certainty, but as a subtle easing, a sense that I'm no longer arguing with myself in every decision. When I pause instead of rushing, I notice how much information exists beneath the noise, how clarity doesn't demand urgency. The future still pulls at me, familiar and convincing, but it no longer feels like an escape from the present. In these moments of attention, I realize that life doesn't require constant negotiation to be valid, and that choosing to stay with what is happening now changes the way everything else unfolds. There's a quiet moment that keeps returning to me, usually when nothing important is happening, when I realize how much of my life was shaped by staying ready instead of staying present. For years, I lived as if awareness was something to achieve later, after I figured things out, after I became more stable, more disciplined, more certain of who I was. In that process, I learned how to function well while feeling only partially here, how to move through days efficiently without fully inhabiting them. I don't think I noticed the cost at first because it didn't arrive as pain, but as absence, a dull sense that something essential was always slightly out of reach. Lately, I've been slowing down enough to feel that gap, to notice how often my mind escapes into planning, replaying, or preparing, rarely allowing the moment to stand on its own. There's discomfort in staying with the present without immediately assigning it meaning or direction, because it removes the illusion of control I've relied on for so long. When I pause, old instincts surface, the urge to improve, to fix, to justify my pace, and I watch them without acting. In those pauses, I notice how my breath steadies, how urgency loosens its grip, how the need to arrive somewhere fades just enough to let something quieter emerge. I'm beginning to understand that awareness isn't a solution, it's a relationship, one that requires patience rather than effort. It doesn't erase uncertainty, but it changes how I carry it. And as I sit with that understanding, I recognize how much of my life was spent waiting for permission to be present, and how gently that permission has been available all along. For a long time, I believed that consistency meant staying the same, holding my ground, honoring commitments even when they quietly disconnected me from myself. I learned to value reliability, to take pride in being steady, predictable, someone others could count on, and I rarely questioned how much of that steadiness was built on suppressing change. There's a subtle pressure in maintaining an identity you've already proven, a constant need to live up to a version of yourself that once made sense but no longer fits in the same way. Lately, I've been noticing the tension that arises when my inner experience shifts, but my outer patterns remain unchanged, when growth asks for adjustment and habit resists. It's uncomfortable to admit that some of what I called loyalty was actually fear of disruption, of disappointing others, of having to explain why I'm no longer aligned with what once felt right. When I allow myself to sit with that discomfort instead of immediately correcting it, I notice how much energy I've spent protecting familiarity. There's a quiet grief in realizing that outgrowing something doesn't make it wrong, just incomplete. I'm learning that change doesn't always require dramatic action. Sometimes it begins as internal permission, a willingness to let identity remain fluid. In moments of stillness, I feel the difference between commitment and obligation, between integrity and inertia. That awareness doesn't rush me forward, but it does make it harder to ignore what no longer resonates. And as I stay with that tension, I sense that consistency rooted in honesty feels very different from consistency rooted in fear, even if, from the outside, they look the same. There was a time when I believed that strength meant emotional distance, that staying composed and unaffected was the safest way to move through the world without losing control. I learned how to observe rather than participate, how to intellectualize experiences instead of allowing myself to feel them fully, and that habit slowly became my default. At first, it felt protective, like a way of maintaining clarity. But over time, it created a subtle separation between what I understood and what I experienced. Lately, I've been noticing how that distance shows up in quiet moments, how easily I analyze my feelings while avoiding the vulnerability of actually sitting with them. There's an unfamiliar discomfort in letting emotions exist without explanation, without immediately turning them into something manageable or useful. When I pause instead of retreating into thought, I notice how my body reacts before my mind intervenes, how sensations carry information that words often miss. I'm beginning to understand that awareness isn't just cognitive, it's embodied, and that real presence requires a willingness to be affected. Old instincts still arise, urging me to stay neutral, to remain in control, to keep a safe distance from intensity, and I acknowledge them without letting them decide. In those moments, something softens, not dramatically, but enough to feel the difference between understanding life and actually participating in it. I'm learning that sensitivity isn't a loss of strength, but a different form of it, one that asks for courage and stillness rather than control. And as I remain with that awareness, I sense how much of myself I've kept at arm's length, and how slowly that distance begins to close when I allow experience to reach me without resistance. I spent a long time believing that if I could just understand myself well enough, I would stop repeating the same patterns, that insight alone would be enough to create change. I collected awareness like evidence, naming behaviors, tracing them back to their origins, explaining myself to myself in careful detail, yet somehow the same reactions continued to surface. Lately, I've been noticing how much of my life runs on automatic responses, not because I lack understanding, but because familiarity is persuasive. There's a humbling realization in seeing how knowledge doesn't always translate into presence, how easily awareness becomes another layer of distance when it stays in the mind. When I slow down enough to observe my reactions as they arise, rather than after the fact, something shifts. There's a brief space between impulse and action that I didn't know how to access before, and within that space, choice becomes possible. I'm beginning to understand that change doesn't come from correcting myself, but from staying with my experience long enough to respond differently. Old narratives still appear, offering explanations, justifications, and certainty, and I let them pass without following. In those moments, attention feels more powerful than effort, and patience feels more transformative than force. I notice how my body softens when I stop trying to fix myself, how reactions lose intensity when they're met with curiosity rather than judgment. This awareness doesn't promise resolution or final clarity, but it does change the relationship I have with my own patterns, turning them from problems to solve into signals to listen to. And that shift quietly reshapes how I move through each moment. For a long time, I thought clarity would come from making the right decisions, from choosing correctly enough times that doubt would eventually disappear. But instead, I found myself growing more careful, more hesitant, as if every choice carried the weight of defining who I was. I learned how to analyze possibilities, anticipate outcomes, and avoid mistakes. Yet that vigilance slowly turned into a quiet tension that followed me even in moments that didn't require certainty. Lately, I've been noticing how much energy I spend trying to resolve the future before it arrives, how often I treat uncertainty as something to eliminate rather than experience. There's an unease in realizing that control can become a form of fear when it's driven by the need to feel safe rather than aligned. When I allow myself to pause without immediately deciding, the discomfort rises first, an urge to move, to choose, to regain stability, and I stay with it. In those pauses, I notice how the body adjusts, how breath deepens, how urgency loses some of its authority. I'm beginning to understand that clarity doesn't always precede action, and that waiting for certainty can quietly keep life at a distance. Old habits still surface, reminding me of the comfort of plans and explanations, and I acknowledge them without surrendering to them. There's a subtle shift when I stop demanding guarantees from myself, when I allow decisions to emerge from presence rather than pressure. In that space, uncertainty feels less like a threat and more like an invitation to remain attentive, to respond honestly, and to trust that awareness can guide movement even when the outcome isn't fully visible. I didn't realize how much of my life was shaped by momentum until I started questioning what would happen if I stopped pushing myself forward. For years, movement felt safer than stillness. Progress felt more reliable than reflection, and staying busy became a way of avoiding the quieter questions that surfaced when things slowed down. I learned to associate worth with motion, to feel uneasy during pauses as if rest needed justification. Lately, I've been noticing how automatic that pattern is, how quickly I reach for distraction when silence stretches too long, how unfamiliar it feels to exist without an immediate objective. There's a subtle discomfort in slowing down, not because something is wrong, but because stillness removes the structure I've relied on to define myself. When I remain with that discomfort instead of escaping it, I notice layers beneath it, expectations I internalized, fears of falling behind, assumptions about what it means to be productive or valuable. I'm beginning to understand that momentum can become a substitute for direction, that movement without awareness doesn't always lead somewhere meaningful. In moments of pause, my attention turns inward, not forcefully, but naturally, and I start to recognize signals I used to override. Old urges still arise, encouraging me to stay ahead, to optimize, to keep going, and I let them pass without acting. There's a quiet recalibration that happens when I allow myself to stop without guilt, a sense that presence doesn't interrupt life but reveals it. And as I sit with that awareness, I notice how being still doesn't diminish me, but slowly reconnects me to what has been waiting underneath the motion all along. Over time, I've come to understand that most of my struggle wasn't caused by what happened to me, but by how tightly I held on to the idea of who I needed to be. I carried that image quietly, refining it, protecting it, measuring myself against it, believing that if I could just become stable enough, disciplined enough, certain enough, everything would finally settle. What I didn't realize was how much effort it took to maintain that tension, how much of my attention was spent monitoring myself rather than inhabiting my life. The shift didn't come as a revelation, but as a gradual release, a series of small moments where I stopped correcting myself and started listening instead. I noticed how often I'd been bracing for judgment that never arrived, how many decisions were shaped by fear of misalignment rather than trust and awareness. There's a quiet humility in accepting that clarity doesn't eliminate doubt, that growth doesn't erase discomfort, and that presence doesn't promise answers. What it offers instead is steadiness, the ability to remain with experience without needing to escape it or define it immediately. I no longer feel the same urgency to resolve myself, to explain every feeling, or to arrive at a finished version of who I am. There's relief in allowing identity to stay fluid, in understanding that consistency can exist without rigidity, that direction doesn't require constant pressure. As I stay with this awareness, I recognize that life isn't something to conquer or optimize, but something to meet, moment by moment, with attention rather than control. And in that meeting, there's a quiet sense of alignment, not because everything makes sense, but because I'm no longer fighting the process of being here.